on our lectures covering experimental design and hypothesis testing. So in the previous lecture, we talked about the basics of experimental design and the basic components and principles behind an experimental design. In this chapter, we're going to talk a lot more about how you actually then utilize those principles and those tools to design your own experimental study. We're also going to touch on a really important concept called null hypothesis significance testing. That'll happen in part 2, but that's really at the root of our ability to make claims about causality within an experiment. So as per our usual, we're going to start off by talking about some research which is relevant to the material covered in this chapter. So the research that is discussed in this chapter is about the idea of brain plasticity. So essentially, you have this question, does exercise make you smarter? And certainly there's been plenty of researchers that have examined the role between physical behavioral activation and the process of cognitive activation. So there's a lot of research on brain plasticity, the ability of the brain to develop and change and grow or be modified. And it's involved in all kinds of research in understanding development, aging, learning, dementias, cognitions, things like that. So we know that impairments to brain plasticity play a really central role in a lot of different neurological conditions, including dementias. And so the idea is that if we study brain plasticity, that has the potential to lead to, treatments or potentially even the ability to reverse or cure some of these illnesses. So this research is really crucial at a larger level, on a basic level of understanding how the brain works, but it has a lot of potential application. So there are 2 studies that are discussed in detail in the chapter. And the reason why we're going to look at these 2 studies is because they represent 2 different types of experimental design to get at a similar question. So the two articles we're going to discuss are It Takes Biking to Learn, Physical Activity Improves Learning a Second Language by Liu and colleagues. The second is The Effect of Acute Treadmill Walking on Cognitive Control and Academic Achievement in Pre-Adolescent Children by Hillman and colleagues. So let's talk about the first one first, the study by Liu. So this is a study in which they randomly assigned 40 college-age Chinese men and women who were trying to learn English to either a control or an experimental group within the experiment. They're utilizing, in this case, what we call a between subjects method, and we'll go into this in great detail. But what that means, though, is you're looking at the differences between subjects against 2 different people, in fact, 2 different sets of people, 2 different, either in your conditions of control or experiment. You're comparing those individuals to one another. So that's the term between comes from that. You're looking at the differences between subjects. This is one of the main of 2 approaches to how you can design an experiment, is you assign people to one group or the other, but exclusively to one or the other. So in this study, what they did is they had these people in the experimental condition attended groups, or actually everyone attended groups. They were 20 minutes once a week, and they were learning foreign language words. In this case, they were Chinese individuals learning English words. And there was 8 consecutive weeks followed by a 15-minute word testing at the end of each of these sessions. And both groups had a final test phase on the 9th week to sort of see how they'd retained information. So the control group, the people that did not receive the manipulation of the independent variable in this case, was a group who used traditional word learning via a list of pictures along with their written and spoken names, and they're presented via a projector in a quiet lab-based room. The experimental group, on the other hand, went through the same process of learning, but did so while riding at a leisurely rate on a stationary bike. They were trying to obtain like 60% max heart rate, which is not super strenuous, but it is, considered mild aerobic activity. And they did that during the whole 20-minute session. So the only difference here is whether or not you're learning sitting in a quiet room or whether or not you're learning riding a bike at the time. And what they showed was that there were higher rates of learning English words for these Chinese students who were randomly assigned to do the exercise compared to the people that were not. So again, the difference between subjects. In the second study by Hillman and colleagues, this is the one I mentioned that was about academic achievement and cognitive control in pre-adolescent children. What they did was they assigned subjects to what's called a within subjects design, and we're going to talk about each of these in detail, the between subjects and within subjects. In this case, in a within subjects design, what happens is the participant effectively receives all levels of the independent variable. And what that means in a conceptual sense is they serve as their own control. So you're comparing the person to themselves in different conditions under different circumstances. So all participants receive all levels of the independent variable. And they were tested on 2 separate days. This is the way they received the 2 levels in this case. On one day they had an aerobic session, and on another day they had a rest session, and in both of these situations they were undergoing some cognitive testing. And what the results showed was that there was improved cognitive functioning following aerobic exercise relative to the resting session. So these 2 studies really illustrate basic experimental designs and how these basic experimental designs offer the strongest test of cause and effect that we really have in terms of the various tools in our toolbox via an experimental design. So let's talk about the basic nuts and bolts of an experiment. We've already covered this a little bit in the previous chapter, but just to reiterate for a moment, the basic ingredients we have here are the independent, dependent, and control variables. So you remember the independent variable is the variable that's manipulated by the experimenter, such as assigning people to 1 level or 2 levels of a particular variable, a control in an experiment. There's all different varieties of ways to do this, but in the simplest sense, you usually have to have at least 2 groups, right? So you have that independent variable that is manipulated. The dependent variable is the outcome that is measured as a result of the manipulation of the independent variable. Hopefully, that's what you're arguing, is that the manipulation of the independent variable caused the change that's then observed in the dependent variable. And of course, remember, there are always confounds. There are always other factors, alternative explanations, moderators, mediators, all these different factors we have to consider, and based upon whatever theory we're operating from. But whatever they are, we often will then include them in the research design as quote unquote control variables. These are things that we want to measure. We want to be able to look at their influence and potentially statistically remove that influence from our understanding of the cause and effect relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So when you're designing an experiment, you're essentially taking these basic elements and you're arranging them in various different ways. So that the only difference between the groups is really the manipulated variable. And primarily we have 2 forms, which we're going to talk about in detail. We have what's called a post-test only design, and we have a pre-test post-test design. So let's talk about both of these in detail. A post-test only design is going to have three features. It's going to have random assignment of the participants to treatment and control conditions. As you may remember from the previous chapter, this is a key element that defines an experiment. This is one of the major things. We have manipulation of the independent variable, the second key element, and then we have the measurement of the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So what you can sometimes do with a post-test only design is to vary the amount of the independent variable. You can have various levels of it. So maybe the person, for example, in the Lou study, they could have had multiple levels rather than just an experimental and a control. What if they had people sitting in a quiet room? In one condition, they had people riding the bike at 60% of max heart rate. In another condition, they had another group that was doing like 80% of max heart rate. It was doing a really strenuous or 90% really strenuous aerobic exercise. Or you could have something lower than the 60% max heart rate. You could have some sort of like really minimal physical activity. This allows you to really parse out how much of the effective dose of the independent variable seems to have an effect on the dependent variable. So a post-test measurement means you manipulate the independent variable and then you measure the dependent variable after the manipulation. So there is only one post-test. It happens after the manipulation. And it's important when we're doing this, when we're designing it, that we have a sensitive enough instrument. Remember we talked in the chapter about measurement. We have to have a sensitive enough instrument to capture the hypothesized difference between the control and the treatment group. So whatever we're using to measure our dependent variable, it has to be able to detect that difference. A post-test must provide essentially a valid assessment of a hypothesized post-test control group, treatment group difference. So that's what's really intending to do. It's trying to measure that difference that arguably was created by our manipulation of the independent variable. And then you, of course, also have to be able to transfer to the real world, to other domains, to attain what's called ecological validity. So this measurement has to be something that it may be a perfect instrument, but it also might be very artificial and not reflect how things tend to happen in the real world. So that's another factor we have to consider when we're designing our post-test instrument. So simple design, post-test only. Let's move on to the alternative. Another alternative way of designing an experiment is what's called pre-test, post-test design. And this is the simplest form where there's only one pre-test and one post-test, but as we'll see in a minute, there are multiple methods as well. This is sometimes referred to as a randomized comparative change design. It's sometimes called a pre-test, post-test control group design, but they all share the same characteristic, which is you establish a baseline measurement of the dependent variable. Whatever the outcome is that you're going to be looking at, you go ahead and measure it before the manipulation of the independent variable, and then you measure it after the manipulation. And what this does is it permits you to detect or to directly measure how much difference there is between the control and experimental groups that changed over time, from the pre-test to the post-test. And sometimes the post-test is identical. The pre-test is identical to the post-test. You give them the exact same measurement, whether it's blood pressure, whether it's a self-report questionnaire, whatever it is that you're doing to measure your dependent variable, you do it exactly the same at pre-test and post-test. That's one way to do it. Sometimes it's optimal to have what are called alternate forms, because there are practice effects for some tests. So in the case of certain tests, once you've seen them, they've been administered to you, there's a practice effect, meaning that you now understand something about the test and therefore will perform better the second time or third time or fourth time. The Stroop test we discussed in the previous chapter is an example. Once you've seen the Stroop test and you've done it, your speed goes up the second time you do it because now you're familiar with it. So alternate forms is a way to mitigate this. You have equivalent but different forms of the same measurement so that the person has not seen the specific questions, but they're considered essentially equivalent in what they measure. So this is one thing, again, that we do to try and control for a confound. A practice effect in this case is a confound. So an alternate form of post-test from the pre-test is one way to overcome that. What you're really trying to check also in this pre-test process is it allows you to see how well random assignment worked in making your groups equivalent. So there's this whole idea that the reason why random assignment is crucial to experimental design is that whatever quirks, whatever individual differences people are bringing to the table, factors that may influence how they respond to the treatment or not receiving the treatment, that those things are evenly distributed by random assignment. So whatever that characteristic is, it's there, but it's equal in both groups in theory. Depending on how small the sample is, the larger the sample is, the better chance of having equivalent groups you get, because the sort of there's this noise sort of gets mitigated by the sheer volume of people that you're using. But ultimately, if you're using a pretest, you can tell if random assignment worked. There are certainly studies where you look and just by sheer chance, for example, the people in the experimental group are much better at the dependent measurement, whatever it is you're using. They may be smarter, faster, in better shape, whatever, for whatever it is you're testing, right? Or the opposite. They might be deficient in some way compared to the control group, right? So by doing a pretest, you can check. It's like it's a check to see whether or not random assignment worked. If there are differences between your groups, that does not mean that you start over. It doesn't mean you throw out the study. In fact, many times that's just something you measure and then you continue going forward, and you're actually able to control for it in how you run your analysis. And we have to be careful about, if we see groups that look different from one another at pretest, we have to be careful about how much we interpret that difference. There's a phenomenon called regression to the mean that we have to be aware of, which is that it's just a random process by which a group that scores well below or well above the mean on a certain test will score closer to the mean on subsequent testing. Outliers are rare, and so there's this process where people tend to get back to being closer to the mean on the second test. So a group with an overall lower pretest score on some factor will likely show a higher post-test average just based on regression to the mean. This is not due to the impact, at least not entirely due to the impact of whatever it is you manipulated or whatever you trained this group on. So we have to be careful about how we interpret those pretest differences, but it is a nice way to check and see if random assignment worked. And it also just allows us to know that, and we can then incorporate that knowledge about the differences between the groups pretest at the pretest stage. We can incorporate that into our analysis, as I said, and at least control for it statistically. So that's sort of a simple pretest, post-test design, 2 tests total, right? 1 before the manipulation, 1 after. But you can have multiple pretest and post-tests throughout the process. Multiple post-tests can identify when the treatment had its effect, and then how long it lasted. Maybe whatever it is you're doing doesn't stick, and so whatever the effect is it disappears over time, and you can actually track that disappearance over time. This is particularly important for treatment research. You know, when you're looking at, does this treatment for alcohol dependence, or this treatment for an illness that you're treating, does it go away, or is the person, have an effective dose for a long period of time? So this is really important to use multiple post-tests in those types of studies. Multiple pre-tests can be used or not administered at all, because the idea is that random assignment is supposed to equate different groups. But sometimes, we want to take multiple pre-tests for reasons. We maybe want to look at where the person is in the past, and then where they are right when the experiment takes place. There's a variety of theoretical reasons why we'd be interested in multiple pre-tests. But again, sometimes giving the test itself has an impact on your participants, and so we always have to be thinking about that. And is it worthwhile? Are we going to introduce practice or carryover effects by giving the person the test as a pretest or not? If not, then certainly it can make sense to be able to track that change over time. It can be very helpful. So there's a concept called dose response in treatment studies, and this is just an example from your book about trying to improve people's fluid intelligence by training on working memory. If you remember, this was discussed in a previous chapter of this article. But the idea was, could people go through cognitive exercises to improve their cognitive functioning? In a sense, could you build up the mental muscle to stave off things like decline, or can you improve your memory in such a way that it's lasting, and therefore you're starting from a better level of functioning if you are to undergo some sort of deficit through dementia or injury or whatever. And what we've found is that the amount of that training is important. And by doing multiple post-tests, after each session, for example, you start to see a trend that is revealed, and you can see this in this graph. So what you're seeing here is the impact of multiple days of training, and you'll notice that these lines here, they start to they trail off as you go, because some people were in a group that received 8 days of training, some were in a group that received 12 days of training, 17 or 19. And the idea is that these are multiple levels of the independent variable, right? We talked about how there can be more than one level. It's not just treatment and experimental group or control group and experimental group, but sometimes you want to have people undergo various degrees of the independent variable so you can see what the real impact is. And what this shows is that the trend continues with additional sessions. Now it is, if you track this graph out, what you'll find is that it is starting to plateau. But ultimately what you're seeing is, for example, with the 19 days training, people are continuing to do better on the test of working memory. There is some improvement. And so this is what's called a dose response effect. And this is why you sometimes need multiple post-tests, because you would not be able, each of these dots on the line represents the average performance for people within that group after each session. And so there's multiple post-tests throughout the process. So let's change gears for a moment and go back to something that we introduced sort of at the beginning of this lecture, and that is the difference between what's called an independent groups or a between subjects design and a repeated measures, aka a within subjects design. So let me address the potentially confusing phrasing that's used by both the book and in general you'll find in research methods. There are synonymous terms for each of these, okay? Independent groups is the same as between subjects design. Repeated measures is the same as within subjects design. I know that can be confusing, but basically what it's taught, the between subjects and within subjects are comparative terms that relate to one another. Independent groups and repeated measures are describing the actual technique itself. So that's why they have these multiple terms. I will try and stick to between and within subjects as much as possible, because I think that really it makes more sense logically for students, at least in my experience teaching this class. So let's start off with the between subjects design, aka the independent groups design. This is when you have, as we discussed earlier, random assignment with the sample divided into groups, and each group receives only one condition or level of the independent variable. So it requires a larger number of participants, because as you can imagine, each person only serves in one level of the independent variable. So you have to, often if you're using an independent groups or between subjects design, you need a larger sample because you have to have people in each of those levels. So the more levels of the independent variable there are, then the more people you're going to need. So, this is where you start to see the push and pull, the economics of research is like, well, I'd like to have groups that receive all different types of levels of this treatment, for example, brain plasticity training or whatever it is. But the more levels, because I want to be able to, look at all the dose response. I want to see like all the differences between these slight variations. The problem is that as you introduce multiple levels of the independent variable, you're also introducing more cells you have to fill with individual from the sample. So your sample then by default starts to get larger the more levels you introduce. What's nice about a between subjects design is it avoids sort of spillover and influence. So people are not being affected by experiencing multiple levels of the independent variable. They just get sort of a pure dose, if you will, of that one level of the independent variable. So as I mentioned, we've talked about a couple of studies throughout this class so far that meet this definition of a between subjects design. We talked about Monkey and colleagues, I think it's Monkey, is how it's pronounced, research on brain plasticity. This was an independent group, independent groups or between subjects design. You were assigned to either receive the brain plasticity training or to receive this sort of control group educational DVD. So in that sense, you only were in one group or the other, and that's an example of a between subjects design. The Liu et al. Study about this, introduced at the beginning of this chapter about riding bikes or not riding stationary bikes while you're learning English words amongst these Chinese students is, again, an example of a between subjects design. You either ended up in the group that sat in the quiet room and received the training on the words, or you were in the group that was on the stationary bikes, but you weren't in both. You didn't experience both multiple levels of the independent variable, just the one. So what's unique and what's I think most identifiable then about a between subjects design is that every participant is only going to experience one level of the independent variable. So this is just an image from your book to sort of help explain the idea of a between subjects design. So as you see, these represent individual participants. This is a pre-test, post-test design as well. So every individual participant receives a pre-test, right? So we can see where their baseline is. And then they are assigned to one of three conditions, treatment A, treatment B, or the control condition. And then everybody receives a post-test to see how they changed in the measurement of the dependent variable by virtue of the treatment or lack of treatment in the control group. But what you can track here is that every participant only goes to one level of the independent variable. A subtype of between subjects design is called matched pairs. This is another sort of approach one can use in a design. The idea is that you match individuals in the treatment group with those in the control group by pairing persons on the basis of some similarity that they share, some characteristic, some objective measurable characteristic. That could be gender, age, year in school, whatever it is you're interested in. If you think that factor is important, if it's going to have some influence, if it is a potential confound, so to speak, what you can then do to control for that is just to make sure that you have one person who has a similar amount or degree or characteristic in each of your groups. So you match them and then you randomly assign them. So this idea that the threat is that if you don't match these characteristics, there's some sort of confound that's going to influence. And in some cases, you can use matching without any random assignment. You just sort of enlist matched pairs to do studies, and this becomes what's called a quasi-experimental design. We'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. But let's just stick for a moment with a true experimental design. What you then do is you take that matching process, and as I said, you then randomly assign the match pairs to one group or the other. So let's say that I have two people that are of a similar age. I bring them into the study, I enroll them in the study, and then amongst that matched pair who have the same age, I randomly assign one of them to go to the experimental group and one to go to the control group. Okay, so this is a matched pairs design that you see within still a between subjects, because it's still between subjects in the sense that each individual still only goes to one level of the independent variable. You either receive the experiment or the control condition, for example. So what you do then is you create that pair, via some characteristic. You simply ask them what's your age, what year of school are you in. You ask them how they identify, whatever it is, or you measure something, IQ or reaction time or whatever it is anything you think is a potential confound, and then you randomly assign one member of the pair to go to the experimental and the other to the control condition. So this really can be helpful in some ways. It can provide greater what's called statistical power. Power is essentially your ability to detect a significant difference between your groups. So by using matched pairs, by controlling for whatever that potential confound is, you're increasing your ability to detect that difference between groups because you're pulling out that noise, so to speak. You're making sure that I shouldn't say pulling it out, you're making sure that that noise is equally represented in each group by virtue of these matched pairs. So this is just an image from your book that basically shows you the process of matched pairs design. So these little images over here just represent gender, and then this could be race, it could be some other characteristic, whatever it is. If you think race is a factor, that's going to be a confound in your study. If this could be the difference in colors could represent people who've had a certain experience in life and those that haven't, people who have been diagnosed with an illness and those that haven't, whatever it is. You then match those individuals into pairs on those characteristics that they share, and then you flip a coin or use a random number generator, and you randomly assign them to your comparison in your experimental group. And as you'll see, these groups can, whatever these indicators are, we can call them, one is obviously intended to be gender, one is intended to be some other characteristic. Your groups have this matching effect along those characteristics. They look very much like one another as far as that characteristic is concerned.